も勝つ。何としてでも生きる。
Izuku Midoriya would have been 4 years old when he found out that he was quirkless. Izuku, he would end up getting picked on for this disability of sorts. The fact that he lacked a quirk basically was almost unheard of nowadays. 20% of the population had no quirks, but in Japan, it was such a rarity, so people would continue to pick on him for not just this, but the fact that he didn't really talk much either. He would eventually be pushed to a breaking point one day, though, from all of this bullying. Izuku would have been picked on by Bakugo and his goons one day. Izuku would have tried to protect one of the kids, but Bakugo would make fun of Izuku, mention how there was no way Izuku would be able to defend himself against them. He was just a Deku, completely defenseless, completely useless, all because of the fact that he had no quirk. Izuku, rather than being sad this time around, he would actually snap. The weather, it would actually begin to shift as soon as Izuku snapped too. Bakugo's goons say they would have had a chill crawl up their backs with the glare Izuku was giving them. To them, it seemed almost as if the boy was controlling the weather, but that was impossible, right? He was quirkless after all. The only logical conclusion they could come up with was that it was just a coincidence at best. Bakugo would be thinking the same thing, meaning he had nothing to be afraid of, right? Well, that was until a lightning bolt actually almost struck Bakugo. The goons, they would immediately try to run inside. They didn't want any part of this any longer. Multiple lightning bolts would try to strike Bakugo and his goons, though. Izuku was trying to teach these guys a lesson at this point. Once Bakugo realized this, he understood right then and there that this wasn't a regular thunderstorm. He was apparently the storm's target. Local heroes, they would notice the situation and they would arrive at the elementary to see what was going on. To them, at first they thought it was a villain attacking, but no, they would only see a kid there. It seemed as if he was controlling the weather itself with the look that he had in his eyes. It was a cold stare now. The heroes, they were trying to take Izuku out of the bad weather, but it felt as if some sort of force was blocking their movements. It wasn't strong enough to hold them back for long, though. Izuku would be brought by the heroes to one of their offices in order to dry off. They would report the situation to the HPSC, the Hero Public Safety Commission, and they would find his mother so she could pick him up as well. Izuku's mother, Inko, would actually arrive to pick him up, glad that he was safe. But the next day, Inko would actually receive a knock at the door. The person that was knocking at the door would actually be wearing a business suit, and he would actually request to talk to the woman and their child about the possibility of Izuku possessing a quirk. Inko would have informed the man of the fact that her son was quirkless, though. Apparently, there were cases of misdiagnosis by doctors, and from the reports the heroes gave yesterday, it seemed like more than just a coincidence that there was a rainstorm only at Izuku's school, the businessman would actually explain. Izuku would even mention how he did see a strange, white, cloudy entity floating next to him yesterday as well. They seemed to be able to read his emotions at the time. As soon as they appeared, it felt as if Izuku had power for once. The man would request for Izuku to show him this figure he was talking about. Izuku would tap into the emotions he felt yesterday, and the being would actually appear, but the man, he wouldn't be able to see them for some reason. Izuku was confused, but the sky would begin to get cloudy though. It was raining now. Not a minute later though, Izuku would call off the rain, breathing heavily. The Hero Public Safety Commission member would be impressed. It seemed that the heroes weren't just trying to hype themselves up. In the reports the heroes gave, they mentioned that the rain did clear up not too long after they took Izuku out to the area. It really did seem like this kid could control the weather. Perhaps this figure Izuku was talking about earlier could have just been some sort of imaginary friend or representation of his quirk that he made in his mind whenever he would activate said quirk. Considering how it seemed to be triggered by a great amount of bullying, a request would be made to have Izuku be personally trained by the Hero Public Safety Commission faculty, considering just how powerful of a quirk Izuku seemingly had. Izuku could be a great hero one day with this quirk of his, but he needed to learn control. They weren't sure of all of the capabilities of Izuku's quirk just yet, but it would be better to have him in a controlled environment in order to discover more. It would be a rather convincing argument for Inko if it was for the good of her child and the streams. Well, she was willing to go along with it. Izuku would be brought to their place of operations, where he would be trained in how to use what the Hero Public Safety Commission believed to be a weather manipulation quirk. While there, he would meet a boy by the name of Kengo Takami. They were 7 years older than Izuku, but he was probably the nicest person to Izuku throughout these years. He could actually bond with the older boy over certain topics. Izuku was treated like an actual human being instead of just a tool at times. As time went by, Izuku would actually begin to see Takami as an older brother figure. The older boy, they had red wings and he could fly with these wings, on top of actually being able to control the feathers individually, as if there was a telekinetic link between him and his feathers. They were incredibly strong feathers too. Both he and Izuku went through harsh training over the years, with there being some interesting side effects. Izuku would have become more of a social outcast throughout the years, only really talking to Takami. On the other hand, Takami would have been on a more talkative side, of course being incredibly calculated with the way he talked, even though it didn't really seem like it at first. The way he used his quirk as well was very calculated. It was as if every move he did, he would think about it 10 minutes in advance, you could say. Izuku would have dumped his quirk weather report while under the tutelage of the Hero Public Safety Commission. Izuku during these years would have eventually reached the age of 15. By the time he had turned 15, Izuku had gained quite a bit of skills with weather report. The skills he had also produced would have also been quite refined by this point as well. The Hero Public Safety Commission saw Izuku as an almost perfect hero now. They just had to fix one issue, that of course being the fact he didn't speak that much. The most Izuku ever really uttered over the years were probably 5-word long sentences at a time. He'd use the least amount of words possible that still got the point across. They wanted to break him out of his social shell though, so Izuku would actually be accepted into UA via recommendations, and on the first day Izuku would sit at the back of the class until Aizawa informed everyone to get dressed in their PE uniforms. The kids would go through a quick examination test, with one girl mentioning how the test seemed like it was going to be fun. This would sour Aizawa's mood even more than it was already, considering he had to be waking up so early. He was a bit of a night owl, you could say. He would usually do most of his hero patrols in the night, so when it came on to this early morning gig, it really wasn't his style at all. Aizawa would basically have this risk go on where it was that last place would be expelled, and of course Izuku would just blow away the competition throughout most of these exams that they were given. The only ones that Izuku wouldn't really get the highest marks in were the ball throw and grip strength test. Izuku was using mainly wind manipulation though throughout these exams. Izuku would pique the curiosity of many students within Class 1A, especially a certain blonde explosion boy. Bakugo would recognize Izuku's family name and the similarities to his mother's friend Inko. Bakugo would make sure to confront Izuku after seeing how high of a ranking Izuku got on the test overall. Bakugo remembered Izuku being quirkless so many years ago, and suddenly he was now able to manipulate the weather. It genuinely didn't make much sense to Bakugo. It really just did not add up in his head. It didn't add up in Bakugo's head all those many years ago, and it still didn't add up now, especially with where Izuku had been for the past 11 years. Izuku wouldn't have had the fondest of memories when it came on to Bakugo, but he would decide to actually answer Bakugo's questions. When Bakugo asked where Izuku had been for so many years, Izuku would simply respond by saying he was training. Bakugo would be angered by the simple response, and he would actually try to pounce on Izuku. Aizawa would bind Bakugo in his scarf though, while temporarily erasing Bakugo's quirk. Another outburst like that would get Bakugo expelled. Mineta would be given the benefit of the doubt though by Aizawa for his performance during the side-to-side jump test. He managed to get the highest score there, so he had to be good for something. But he would make it very clear to the boy that he was on thin ice as far as Aizawa was concerned. News about All Might being a teacher at UA would actually spread like wildfire in the upcoming weeks of school, with there even being a news outlet around UA's gates. Many other kids would get swarmed by the newscasters, but in Izuku's case, he would simply fly over them. Izuku would be lying if he said he wasn't interested in finding out if the rumors were true though about All Might actually teaching at UA. The rumors, well, they did turn out to be true, and the students, they would find out that they were going to be doing a battle simulation, and they'd even get to dress up in the hero costumes that they designed months in advance. Izuku wouldn't dress in anything special. Instead, he would just wear an all-white suit with his hair slicked back. Overall, a pretty plain design that even Ochako would comment on. Izuku and Ochako, they would be paired up against Bakugo and Ida, and although Bakugo would be excited to fight and show his superiority against Izuku, the green-haired boy would show no interest in actually entertaining Bakugo here. He just sent an air pressure attack at Bakugo, causing him to slam against the wall. The force and impact were enough to knock out Bakugo instantly. Izuku and Ochako would find Ida, and at this point, Ida hadn't had enough time to completely clear the area of all the items Ochako could use as projectiles. Ochako would use this to her advantage by having boxes fall on Ida, while Izuku would just walk over to the bomb. Once he touched it, he and Ochako would have officially won the competition. The kids would be impressed with how easily Izuku was able to handle the situation. Todoroki would have watched the scene as well and noticed the look in Izuku's eyes. Izuku had gone through harsh training over the years as well. At least that's when Todoroki was able to figure out. The amount of control Izuku had in that situation was cool and all, but Todoroki felt a bit of a connection, and where both of them didn't really have the happiest of childhoods. When it was Todoroki's time, he would actually go on to just freeze the entire building, being arguably more impressive than Izuku. From a pure power aspect, Izuku showed the most control in the situation though, which many other students would take into consideration when electing a class president the next day. Izuku would win with Momo being his vice president. Izuku would immediately step down though, giving the role over to Momo. She would actually have Ida as her vice president from there. At lunch, Ochako would question Izuku's decision on stepping down from such a position. Ochako would even admit that she voted for him as well, so it was a bit sad to see him just to step down from the role like that. Izuku would simply explain that it seemed like too much work for him. Ochako would just pout when hearing this, but she wouldn't have had enough time to think about it for too long. What would end up happening is that alarms would blare, and supposedly there were actually intruders on UA campus. Ida would find out though that it was just the news, so he would have Ochako float him up to the wall so that he could easily get everybody's attention. He'd explain the situation to everyone, calming them down, which would help it would basically have Ida be put into a better light when it came on to Class 1A, rather than just seeming like a random person to them. Class 1A would find out that they were going on a trip to a special facility outside of UA a couple days later, so they were going to go by bus. While on the way to the USJ, students would question what Izuku's quirk was, considering what they saw already. Izuku would comply by informing everyone that it was weather manipulation. It would shock many of the students considering how strong the quirk sounded. While asking about downsides, Izuku would mention that he didn't really have one besides his body, just being that of an average person at the end of the day, and maybe him exerting himself too much. When the kids made it to the USJ, they would get confronted by villains coming out of a portal. In response, Izuku would lower the temperature throughout most of the USJ, and it would leave most of the villains immobile from the unlivable temperatures. It was basically below zero at this point. Shigaraki, he would get teleported away from the USJ by Kurogiri. They would just leave the Nomu there though. The Nomu, it would actually do its best to survive through the harsh temperatures, but Izuku, he would summon a thundercloud over the monster. A lightning bolt would strike, granting their regeneration and shock absorption. Most of the students would be amazed at what but they would be amazed at what Izuku was capable of. Bakugo, on the other hand, he would be annoyed with how the green-haired dude was just stealing all of the spotlight. This was a completely different person from the one he knew so many years ago. There wouldn't have been any casualties or serious injuries here. There wouldn't really be anything to report beyond there being some villains at the USJ that were easily contained. Aizawa would bring up the sports festival to Class 1A's attention when they got back to UA the next day, and he would encourage them to train as hard as possible for the upcoming event since there would be steep competition. Heroes would also be watching the event, scouting for potential sidekicks and interns. At the beginning of the sports festival, Bakugo, who managed to get first place at the entrance exam, would actually be the one to speak here. Bakugo would make the declaration that he would win the entirety of the sports festival, but he would quickly eat his words when Izuku blew away the competition in the first part of the sports festival. You see, Izuku, he would simply have air currents propel him past the robots and every other obstacle, making his way to the exit gate. Izuku would be awarded 10 million points for getting first place in the obstacle course. Next up would be the cavalry battle, where, in all honesty, he would need a group of 3 to 4 individuals, which would be annoying knowing he would have to actually interact with others here. He wasn't the best at communicating with people after all, but at the same time he didn't want to get disqualified so early on. So he would recruit Ida, Momo, and Tokoyami, seeing as how they would probably be some of the trickiest individuals to deal with if they were ever on another team. Throughout most of the cavalry battle, he would send air currents at people with enough pressure to push them back. Todoroki and Bakugo, they would attempt to snatch Izuku's headband, but they would fail. Todoroki would try to corner Izuku at one point, but the green-haired lad, he would float up out of Todoroki's reach. The tournament would be too easy for Izuku. Well, of course, this would have happened after Izuku managed to get first place in the cavalry battle. When it came on to the tournament, Izuku would simply blow away Shinso before he even had the chance to talk. When it came on to Todoroki, he wouldn't force him to use his fire. Instead, Izuku would float up into the sky, sending lightning bolts at the boy. Todoroki would try to block it with his ice, but find out that Izuku had more in his arsenal than just that. Todoroki would get knocked out after getting pummeled by hail. Hail, basically. Basically, just look it up. Hail. Hail. Izuku would make the floor wet from rain he produced when it came on to his fight against Ida, causing the blue-head boy to go sliding out of the ring. Bakugo would be damped from rain clouds attacking him in the beginning. This would prevent him from effectively using his quake. Izuku, he would send air pressure at Bakugo right after, and this would throw him out of the ring as well. Bakugo would be enraged, finding it to be an unfair fight, but Izuku, he would pay him no mind. Izuku would receive multiple hero internship offers afterwards. Eventually, he would decide to go with Endeavor though. Hawks had already told him that he wouldn't take Izuku up as an intern since the boy needed to become more social after all. And although they were basically brothers, if Hawks were to take up Izuku as an intern right now, this wouldn't really be helping Izuku in the long run. He'd never make his way out of his shell if he didn't try to at least interact with others more often. He would congratulate Izuku for his successfulness at the sports festival though. Izuku would just mutter how this was just going to be a drag. Midnight would help the students select hero names for themselves, with Izuku eventually going with Tempest. He originally would have named himself after his stand, quick that he still believed it was. But he felt it would have been a bit too predictable. While under Endeavor, the man would actually reflect on everything Izuku displayed back at the sports festival. He was even more powerful than the Shoto, which was almost a terrifying thought in his mind, especially if Todoroki were to use his flames and still lose to Izuku. He figured Izuku would be a good backup plan in case Shoto continued to refuse to use his flames at the very least, though. During a patrol one night, Izuku, Shoto, and Endeavor, they would be attacked by several Nomu. Izuku would immediately strike them down in response. They would find out that these monsters were all around the city though. Throughout the night, they'd be busy dealing with the Nomu while grouping up with some other heroes. One of the heroes would mention something about Ida missing though. Izuku wouldn't have known the reason why Ida disappeared. It was very unusual, at least from the amount of Ida's personality the stand user was able to grasp. By the time the heroes found Ida, it was already too late for the boy. He was another victim to the hero killer's stain. This would strangely cause a reaction from Izuku. A tear would actually fall down Izuku's face. He would ball up his hand into a fist. He didn't know Ida all that well, but he was his classmate at the end of the day. It hurt to find out they suffered such a cruel fate. Izuku would be even more determined to become a hero now in order to avoid having something like this from ever happening again. When returning to UA, the bad news would have already been made well aware to the students, but they couldn't afford to focus on Ida's death for too long. All Might would have an exercise for the students in order to show the fruits of their labors from their internships. It would revolve around a group racing to find All Might. The first to reach this location would win. Izuku would simply fly over to the blonde hero's location though. It was a rather easy exercise for Izuku. All Might would sweat drop seeing the lack of emotion on Izuku's face. For the final exams, Class 1A would get into rooms in order to study. Izuku wouldn't be all that interested in joining a specific group, but Ochako, she seemed to insist on sharing notes with each other. Todoroki would admit to having some difficulty in a certain subject, and Izuku seemed to have an understanding for most topics, even if he was on the more quiet side. He was the type to explain things in the most simplest of ways too, so we had hopes Izuku could do better than Momo here. Probably condense the lessons into just a couple of words that Shoto would be able to comprehend rather easily. Izuku would just sigh in exasperation, but he would agree to tutor his peers. The practical part of the exams, though, the students assumed was just fighting robots, so they weren't all that worried at first. That was until the teachers revealed that the students would actually be fighting them instead, while also being in pairs of two. Izuku and Bakugo would be paired up together, considering how they were polar opposites. Izuku would try to formulate a plan with Bakugo, but the explosive blonde wanted to fight All Might and nothing more. Izuku would think about it for a second before nodding, agreeing that he could fight the man. Bakugo would be the distraction while Izuku would make his way over to the exit. Bakugo would tisk, calling Izuku a coward, but he would still agree to the plan. All Might were trying to send Izuku off course a couple of times, but Bakugo would constantly get in the way. Izuku would speed his way to the exit and win the exam within the first 5 minutes. It would actually upset Bakugo though, since he never really got to push his limits against the number one hero. Izuku would just ignore Bakugo's complaints though. Izuku would also decide to skip out on the class shopping for items needed during their time at the mountain lodge. On the ride to the mountain lodge, the bus would actually make a sudden stop in the forest. The kids, they would all question what was going on when seeing that they were in the middle of nowhere. Pixie Bob would actually introduce himself here before creating date monsters for the students to fight. The class would panic seeing this. Azawa would have been long gone at this point as well. Izuku would simply create rain, slowing down the creature's movements. Most of the students would have an easier time dealing with the monsters from there. Izuku would fly to the top of the mountain, making his way over there around the same time as Aizawa. Aizawa would mutter something about how annoying Izuku's flight ability could be, but Izuku wouldn't really care. Izuku would just meet the rest of the Pussycats and Kota. Kota, though, he would try to punch Izuku in the family jewels. Izuku's stand weather report would actually grab Kota's wrist though, stopping that from actually happening. Kota would be confused and he would struggle to get his arm released. Izuku would have weather report eventually release its grip on Kota and relax. Well, Izuku would end up relaxing afterwards, waiting for the rest of his classmates to arrive at the scene. It would have been evening by the time the rest made it up there. They would envy Izuku, seeing as how he was perfectly fine, while the rest of them had to fight date monsters, even if Izuku made it somewhat easier for them by wetting up the monsters, making it easier for them to punch through. Izuku and his classmates, they would end up finding out from Aizawa the next day that, well, they would have to train their quirks for the following days, considering how the classmates, they really only went through emotional growth. They never really got through the physical part of growth yet though. Izuku would be forced to extend his weather manipulations range to its absolute limits for his form of training. At night, the students of Class 1A and B, they would decide to play a little game involving them going in groups of 2 to the forest while someone from the other class would try to scare them. Something bad would happen though. villains had apparently found their location and they were attacking students and heroes left and right. Izuku would go on to find Kota being confronted by a villain. His name was Muscular. Izuku would react right then and there by electrocuting the man though before rescuing Kota. They noticed the forest was on fire and Izuku would summon rain clouds to extinguish the fire. It took a little while, but it did end up extinguishing over time. The villains, they would have lost most of their elements at this point. Izuku would find Shonshi's group and he would also eventually find Bakugo as well. Although they would be attacked by a villain, Izuku would simply send hail at them. Most of the villains wouldn't be able to contend with Izuku at this point. They would be able to prevent Bakugo's capture in this timeline here. The Kamino Ward incident wouldn't have happened here either. All Might would realize right then and there that he needed to pass on one for all to someone now. After the event at the mountain lodge, that is. He was down to 1 hour now at this point, and with the villains continuing to make more moves now, it was crucial to find a successor. All Might would decide to go with Kirishima here. Class 1A would go on to work on developing super moves for the upcoming hero licensing exam. This would actually excite Izuku for the simple fact that he had another chance at getting a hero license since, well, beforehand he always failed for the simple fact he had poor communication skills. Izuku, while thinking of super moves, would end up developing a new technique. This technique would involve him making the metaphor "it's raining cats and dogs" reality. But of course, in his case though, it wouldn't be raining cats and dogs. No, it would actually be raining snails. It was odd, but it accomplished the job. On the day of the actual hero licensing exam, many schools would try to gun for UA, but Izuku would manipulate the wind. He would send all of the spheres back at the flingers. Many of the competitors would be eliminated just from that. Izuku would easily make it to the second part of the exam, though, after this stunt. For the most part though, while waiting for the rest of his classmates and other competitors to join the waiting room, Izuku would take his time to just relax. Just really focus on what's going to be the next part of this exam. He'd been through it a couple of times already. Of course, he always failed at this one particular part though, and he was hoping that this time around he would actually be able to do well here. Izuku would have to actually communicate with people at the second part of the hero licensing exam, and these people were basically acting as if they were victims from what do you call it again? Mass villain attack, you could say. Basically, a villain was attacking and wrecked their city, you could say. So that's why Izuku would prioritize trying to comfort and rescue the civilians. Although he would still lose points for his awkwardness when it came onto communication. By the end of the exams though, Izuku would be staring down the board in order to see his name. His heart, it would be racing, it would be pounding. He wasn't sure if he had actually won this time, if he managed to actually show that he was good enough to be a pro hero, even if he did have some issues with his communication skills. And that is where I'm going to basically be leaving it off right now, people. It is your boy King Next signing out. You guys already know the deal. If you like my videos, like the video. If you've been rocking with my content for a little while now, then you should definitely subscribe. Oh, leave a comment too. I would like to thank Neptune for the fact that they did help me a little bit when it came on to tying up like loose ends when it came on to this series. And yeah, and that's basically going to be like part 1 or 2 for the movie What If. So yeah, peace.